Good morning. Today is the 5th day of Iyar, the 13th of May, and we're holding by the second reading of Parashat Emor. And the second reading, like a lot of the Parsha, at least the first four readings, are about more laws that pertain to the priests, and then from the fourth reading and on, almost everything is about the festivals, and this is one of the main sections of the Torah that deals with the festivals. We'll get to that at the end on Wednesday. So today, let's focus on the second reading. We actually talked about this last year. I think there was a long discussion there about why it is that people that have blemishes or defects, priests that have blemishes or defects, cannot serve in the temple. And I believe that last year we talked about this general principle. For us, especially in the modern Western world, it seems that somebody who has a blemish, who has a handicap, a defect, on the contrary, should be encouraged to be like everyone else. So this is focusing on the individual. But as I believe we said last year, the temple is not a focus on the individual, it is a focus on God. And I refer you to that discussion. Let's not get into it since we did it last year. But here we want to take a different look at what it means to have a blemish or a defect. What exactly is this blemish or defect? So, what we want to look at is, let's start from a verse in Jeremiah 31:8. And there it says, "Hineni mevi otam me'eretz tzafon v'kibatzti mi'arketei haaretz, bam iver upiseh acharav yoledet yachdav ka'al gadol yeshuvo hena." I'm sorry, I should have first read the verse in our reading in Leviticus. So let's read that just to get into the context here. So I'll read the first three verses of today's portion, verses 16, 17, and 18. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron, saying, any man among your descendants throughout their generations who has a bodily defect may not approach the altar to offer up God's food." God's food is the sacrifices that go on the altar. "For it is not proper that any man who has such a defect should approach the altar." Specifically, a blind man, a lame man, a man whose nose is sunken. It's between his eyes, so that it's like that the eyes are in one continuum. And a man with mismatched limbs, meaning the one eye is larger than the other, or one leg is longer than the other, and so on. And then there's a continuation of the list here. But we want to talk about this word mum, which is usually translated either as a blemish or a defect. And specifically, we just mentioned that a person who is blind or lame. So now let's get back to this verse in Jeremiah 31, which clearly is referring to our verse. And by the way, this is not the only time that this phrase appears, someone who is blind or lame, but certainly Jeremiah 31 here, verse 8, is referring to it. And he writes like this, "I will bring them in from the northland, gather them from the ends of the earth, the blind and the lame together, those with child and those in labor, in a vast throng they shall return here." This chapter in general is talking about the redemption, and here it's talking about the ingathering of the exiles. And what Jeremiah is saying is that don't expect the exiles that will come back to the land of Israel to be people who are perfectly healthy. On the contrary, who is he going to gather together? It seems like all the crippled, all the handicapped. And there's a big question about why is that? Why not just say, like he says at the end of the verse, that a great throng will return here? Why is there this insistence to say that when the redemption comes, the gathering of the exiles will not only include, but be mostly made up of people who are handicapped in some way, or women who are either pregnant or in labor? What's the idea behind this? Why mention this? And it seems to be in contradistinction to the use of the blind and the lame in our reading, where here it says that by the priesthood they cannot approach the altar. So what is exactly this idea that's hiding behind this? So let's look at the Talmud, Sanhedrin 91a, and there it reads like this: Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is someone by the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And he is considered to have been the Greek word was kobustus. Kobustus is something like a scoundrel, a vandal, someone who, even a road robber. And at some point he met up with Rabbi Yochanan, who was the greatest sage in the land of Israel after the destruction of the temple. He is the most important source in the Jerusalem Talmud. There's two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian, which was written in Babylon, and there's the one that was written in the land of Israel, which is called the Jerusalem Talmud. So Rabbi Yochanan, he lived apparently to a very old age, 120 years, and the last 40 years of his life he was dedicated to preserving and developing the Torah in the land of Israel. He lived in Tiberias, that's where his yeshiva was. And when he was a younger man, he met Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was his robber name, sort of like a Sundance Kid, something like that, like some kind of nickname that they gave him, Reish Lakish. And a whole story, to make it short, Reish Lakish decided to become a penitent. He became a Baal Tshuva, and he became not only a Baal Tshuva, he also married Rabbi Yochanan's sister, and he was his most important student. And when Reish Lakish learnt with him, he felt that he was alive, Rabbi Yochanan. It brought him life. And their connection was so strong that when Rabbi Yochanan passed away, even though Reish Lakish was much younger, he passed away almost immediately afterwards. He said, there's no point to my being in the world anymore if I can't learn from my teacher. So Reish Lakish, he says like this. He says there's a contradiction between two verses. With regard, now, notice this, he's going to take the verse from Jeremiah, and he's not going to explain it about the redemption. He's going to explain it about the resurrection of the dead. And he says like this: it is written, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the ends of the earth, and together the blind and the lame together, the pregnant woman, the woman giving birth together. Indicating, right, that's our verse from Jeremiah 31, that at the end of days there will still be people with physical defects. And yet, we have another verse from Isaiah 35:6. There it says, then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. So what does this indicate? It indicates that at the end of days, in the resurrection perhaps, there will be no one with defects. So how do you explain the contradiction between these two verses? Reish Lakish says, when the resurrected will arise, they will still be afflicted with their defects, and then they will be healed. So that's Reish Lakish, that's his idea here. So what Jeremiah is talking about, that they will be with defects, is talking about when they stand up from their graves, as it were. When they come back to life. When they come back to life, they're still going to have defects. The question is why? Why do they need to have defects? The explanation is that Rav Ginsburg offers is very simple and straightforward, and it has to do a lot with Reish Lakish's perspective on what defects are, and what does it mean to heal them. A defect is caused by a person's sins. It's caused by something. The Torah doesn't see defects as some random event in nature. That's not the type of defects we're talking about. There are handicaps that a person can be born with, and then we don't attribute it to the person. We just say it's true that nature sometimes doesn't do everything right, because nature is not perfect. But there are defects that a person acquires during his lifetime. And these defects, they're caused by our actions. They're caused by our behavior. So these defects, in a certain sense, they define us. They define us. They sort of tell us what kind of person we are. And a person carries with him these defects that he's acquired during his life. Sometimes they're caused by poor nutrition, poor behavior, poor hygiene, not paying attention on the road, all kinds of things that people do to themselves. Now, that type of defect, a person will come out of the grave with. Why? Because he has to feel that he's healed by God. In other words, he can't feel the resurrection of the dead is an act of God. It's not an act of man. A lot of times people say, maybe the resurrection of the dead will be some kind of scientific advancement that we'll have, and we'll be able to reconstruct a person from their DNA. But if you reconstruct a person from their DNA, you don't expect them to have the defects acquired during their lifetime. You expect them to be perfectly healthy when you rebuild them. And yet here it says, no, that there's going to be this thing, Rish Lakish understands it this way, that the person's going to stand with the defects that he had during his life. Why? Because he needs to feel God's hand. He needs to feel that becoming whole again is not something that is only up to me. It's not something that's dependent on my actions. A lot depends on my actions. My whole lifetime depends on my actions. But when the time comes, the whole point of the resurrection of the dead, the whole point of the redemption, is to make us meet God in a different way, in a way that we haven't met Him so far. We've only met Him indirectly, one would say. Here, it's literally the hand of God that takes the person and heals him from these defects. Not only that, the word for defect, which in Hebrew is mum, is actually a holy name. Mem Vav Mem. It's the final triplet of the 72 triplets that comes out of the verses in Beshalach that we've seen in the past. 3 consecutive verses, only time in the entire Torah that there are 3 consecutive verses with 72 letters each. And so we join them together in a certain way, in a certain pattern, in order to create these holy names. And the final name of the 72 is Mum. It means defect. 72 itself is the gematria, it's the value of loving kindness. It's sort of like saying, and this is what Reish Lakish means, is that when a person is resurrected, he has to feel that he is still him, he is still he himself. He recognizes himself through his defects, what he's done to himself during his lifetime, what he's carrying with him, and then he has to feel that there is a new revelation of godliness in the world that heals him. And it doesn't just heal him, it heals him instantaneously, all at once. That is the type of frame of mind, the perspective that someone like Reish Lakish, who's a penitent, has. Because how should a penitent look at the world? And by the way, this is the whole attitude, the whole perspective of the redemption, the whole perspective of the resurrection of the dead, is that everything happens instantaneously. It's not a process anymore. That's the difference between how God reveals himself in the world now, which is through processes, and how he will reveal himself once the redemption begins and we finally come to the resurrection of the dead. It will be instantaneous, because until now what we are seeing from God, the experience we have of godliness, is one that is limited. It's the limited light, the type of light that we can bear, the type of revelation, like we always say, is like a revelation. It's revealing God to us in a way that we can handle it. But now we can only handle a limited revelation. In the future, we will be ready for the revelation of God himself, as it were. The essence itself will be revealed. And when the essence itself is revealed, everything happens instantaneously. And that's the type of thinking that Reish Lakish has. He says, every time that a person does teshuvah, a person becomes a Baal Tshuva, he becomes a penitent, what he really is doing is he's revealing this light within himself, this light of God within himself that creates change instantaneously. At a moment's notice, everything changes. That's the way a Baal Tshuva has to think about himself. We now, in this time of the year, and we'll end with this, are in a time of a Baal Tshuva who's trying to make sense of his experience. Because on the first day of Passover, when we sat down to the Seder, everything happened at once. We were freed from Egypt in an instant, in one moment, be'etzem hayom hazeh. In the day itself, the heat of the day, that's when we were freed. But that is about tshuva experience. That is an instantaneous experience, and then needs to be taken, and during 49 days, the next 49 days, we sort of take it piece by piece. We try to integrate it. We try to understand it. But the redemption is not like that. The redemption is, in a certain sense, a bewilderment. How things can happen so quickly. How is it possible? It almost seems instantaneous. And we need to feel that in order to know that it's God's hand who healed us. That it's not the regular processes at work in the world. This is not natural. This is something supernatural. So this whole idea of the ingathering of the exiles being described as people coming with all these defects is because these defects are then healed instantaneously because of the tshuva, because of the penitence that people do, because they return to God. And then the healing is instantaneous, and that way we know that we have entered a different era of human existence. Thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.